Zeph'tal of the Vorthak lounged in his anti-grav chair like he owned the entire Galactic Academy, which, considering his family's donation to the new quantum physics wing, he practically did. His crystalline blue skin shimmered with that insufferable glow that only came from generations of selective breeding and an ego the size of 3 solar systems. Another fresh batch of primitives, he sneered, watching the orientation group shuffle past the main courtyard. His telepathic abilities crackled around his temples like tiny lightning bolts, a constant reminder to everyone within 50 meters that he could read their thoughts as easily as a children's picture book. The academy buzzed with its usual morning chaos. Tentacled Glorpians slithered between classes, their thoughts as slippery as their skin. Gas-based Nebulon students floated overhead, thinking in colors and chemical equations that gave most species headaches. The insectoid Chitauri clicked their mandibles in perfect mathematical harmony, their hive-mind thoughts creating a constant background hum of shared consciousness. And then there were the easy targets. Zeph'tal's favorite pastime involved cornering new students, particularly the ones from recently contacted worlds. Oh, how he relished watching their primitive little minds scramble when he casually mentioned their deepest fears or most embarrassing memories. It was almost too easy, really, like taking candy from a larval squibbian. Zeph'tal, perhaps you could focus that remarkable mental capacity on today's lesson, instead of terrorizing freshmen. Professor Klemdar's voice carried across the courtyard, dripping with the kind of sarcasm that only came from teaching spoiled alien brats for 3 centuries. The old mentary's 4 eyes rolled in different directions, a sure sign of his annoyance. His tentacle beard twitched as he floated past on his mobility disk, quantum physics equations still scribbling themselves across his translucent skin from his morning lecture. "Just maintaining campus morale, Professor," Zeph'tal replied, his mental voice broadcasting loud enough for half the courtyard to hear. Several students winced and clutched their heads. Blixandra, a sharp-tongued Isirian, with scales that changed color based on her mood, currently flashed annoyed orange. "More like maintaining your reputation as the Academy's biggest psychic bully." Mortwing, whose species name was unpronounceable by most vocal cords, simply emanated agreement through his bioluminescent patches. Zeph'tal just smiled. Today felt like a good day to remind everyone why messing with a Vorthak mind reader was a supremely bad idea. The announcement crackled through the Academy's neural link communication system at precisely 11:47 Galactic Standard Time. "Attention students and faculty. Please welcome our newest exchange participant from the recently contacted world of Earth, Marcus Chen, representing the species Homo sapiens." A collective ripple of curiosity mixed with barely concealed amusement swept through the dining hall. Earth? Most students had to access their neural databases just to remember which backwater spiral arm that little rock orbited in. Marcus Chen walked into the cafeteria looking exactly like what every alien expected from a primitive species. 2 legs, 2 arms, ridiculously symmetrical features, and a head so disproportionately large compared to his body that several Chitauri actually chittered in what passed for their version of laughter. "Look at that cranium," whispered Blixandra, her scales shifting to amused purple. "It is huge, but the brain scans from his medical file show it is mostly empty space. How inefficient. The species apparently still uses chemical signals to communicate emotions," added Mortwing, his bioluminescent patches pulsing in what other species had learned meant mockery. "They leak salt water from their optical sensors when distressed." Zeph'tal nearly choked on his liquid nutrition supplement. This was too perfect. A primitive biped with an oversized head full of nothing but chemical soup. It would be like reading the thoughts of a particularly dim houseplant. Marcus grabbed a tray and stared at the food dispensers with the kind of confusion that suggested his species had not yet mastered basic technology. He poked at the molecular gastronomy unit 3 times before figuring out the mental command interface, then proceeded to select what appeared to be a sandwich. An actual physical sandwich. Not even deconstructed atoms reassembled into optimal nutrition ratios. "By the 7 moons of Zephyr," muttered a Glorpian student, "it eats dead organic matter in its original form." Words spread faster than a quantum entanglement cascade. Within minutes, Half the dining hall had found reasons to relocate closer to the humans' table. They pretended to study, but their thoughts buzzed with anticipation. Everyone knew what came next. Zeph'tal cracked his knuckles, a habit he had picked up from some ancient Earth entertainment broadcasts. The irony was not lost on him. He stood slowly, letting his natural telepathic aura expand like ripples in a pond. Students nearby winced as their surface thoughts got momentarily scrambled. The crowd parted before him as he walked toward Marcus, who sat alone at a corner table, methodically chewing his primitive food and occasionally glancing around the room with what looked like genuine curiosity rather than fear. "This should be interesting," Professor Klemdar observed from the faculty section, though whether he meant interesting good or interesting catastrophic remained unclear. The dining hall fell silent except for the gentle hum of anti-gravity generators and the soft squelch of Glorpian locomotion. Showtime. Zeph'tal approached Marcus's table with the casual confidence of a predator who had never met anything that could fight back. His telepathic abilities hummed at low power, just enough to let everyone in the dining hall feel the psychic pressure building. This was his signature move. The slow, deliberate mental approach that gave his victims time to realize what was coming and panic accordingly. "Welcome to Galactic Academy," he said aloud, his voice carrying just the right amount of false warmth. "I am Zeph'tal. Perhaps you would like someone to show you around." Marcus looked up from his sandwich, a bit of what appeared to be processed plant matter hanging from the corner of his mouth. "Oh hey, thanks. That would be great. This place is incredible. I keep expecting someone to tell me this is all some elaborate joke." "Perfect." Zeph'tal smiled and extended his mental tendrils toward Marcus's mind, expecting to encounter the usual barriers of a primitive consciousness, basic survival instincts, simple emotional responses, maybe some crude mating considerations. Instead, he slammed face first into the mental equivalent of a tornado made of pure insanity. Cars. Flying cars everywhere. But not just any cars. Cars with wings that flapped like birds. Cars that sang opera while dispensing ice cream. Cars that had evolved opposable thumbs and were apparently holding jobs in accounting. And that was just the first layer. Zeph'tal blinked hard and tried to focus. Surely this was just surface imagination, the kind of random visual noise that primitive species generated when they were not thinking about important things like survival or reproduction. He pushed deeper and immediately regretted it. A purple elephant wearing a business suit was giving a PowerPoint presentation to a board of directors who were all different varieties of breakfast cereal. The elephant was explaining the quarterly profit margins of rainbow distribution, while a small dragon in the corner took minutes and occasionally breathed fire on anyone who disagreed with the financial projections. "What in the name of the 7 spiral arms?" Zeph'tal muttered, his mental voice wavering. But wait, there was more. Much more. Cats that walked upright and ran interstellar corporations. Trees that grew smartphones instead of fruit. A version of Marcus himself, but with laser eyes, fighting what appeared to be a giant rubber duck in the middle of downtown Manhattan, while civilians cheered and threw confetti made of tiny sandwiches. And somehow, underneath all of this absolute madness, Marcus was simultaneously thinking about whether he had remembered to water his plants back on Earth, wondering if the aliens had Netflix, calculating the tip for a restaurant bill from 3 weeks ago, and composing a mental grocery list that included items like milk, bread, eggs, and maybe some of those cookies Mom likes. Zeph'tal's eye started twitching. This was not how primitive minds were supposed to work. Where was the simple, linear thought progression? Where were the basic survival concerns? Where was the terror that should be flooding this creature's consciousness right about now? "So," Marcus said, taking another bite of his sandwich, "what do you study here?" The course catalogue was pretty confusing. Half the subjects don't even have names I can pronounce. Meanwhile, inside his head, a marching band made entirely of household appliances was performing a halftime show, while Marcus simultaneously worried about whether he had embarrassed himself in front of the blue-skinned alien, wondered what his dog was doing right now, and fantasized about inventing a time machine just so he could go back and change his high school yearbook photo. Zeph'tal's confident smirk was starting to crack around the edges. This was ridiculous. Zeph'tal had been reading minds since he was old enough to form coherent thoughts, and no primitive species had ever given him this much trouble. The human's surface consciousness was clearly just some kind of defensive mechanism, probably an evolutionary adaptation to confuse predators. All he needed to do was push past the mental static and find the real thoughts underneath. Time to show this backwater biped what a true Vorthark mind reader could accomplish. Zeph'tal closed his eyes and concentrated, sending his psychic probe deeper into Marcus's consciousness like a drill boring through rock. He expected to break through the chaos and find the simple primal thoughts that surely lurked beneath all that nonsense about flying cars and business-suited elephants. Instead, he fell into a rabbit hole that would have made Lewis Carroll weep with envy. The first thing that hit him was a memory of Marcus at age 7, standing in his grandmother's kitchen while she made cookies. But this was not just a memory, it was a memory wrapped in 17 different emotional layers, connected to 43 other seemingly unrelated experiences, and somehow tied to Marcus's current worry about whether he had offended someone at a party 6 months ago by laughing too loud at a joke about staplers. And that was just one thread in an impossibly complex web. Zeph'tal's mental probe ricocheted between a childhood fear of the monster under the bed, which had somehow evolved into a sophisticated philosophical debate about the nature of darkness, a half-remembered plot from a movie about robots that fall in love currently being mashed up with Marcus's thoughts about whether aliens experience romantic attraction, and a recurring anxiety dream about showing up to an exam naked, which was now blending with his current nervousness about fitting in at the academy. By the infinite void, Zeph'tal gasped, his physical body starting to sweat despite the climate-controlled dining hall. How does this species function with this much mental noise? But the deeper he went, the worse it got. Marcus's subconscious was not a neat, organized filing system like every other species Zeph'tal had encountered. It was more like a hurricane had hit a library, then someone had fed the scattered pages to a hyperactive AI that organized information by emotional color coding and smell associations. A random Tuesday from when Marcus was 14 suddenly connected to his current thoughts about lunch, which triggered a memory of his first pet goldfish, which somehow led to a complex philosophical consideration about whether fish understand the concept of freedom, which then branched into wondering if the academy cafeteria had fish on the menu, and would eating alien fish be morally different from eating Earth fish? And did fish from different planets have different souls, and what was a soul anyway? And did aliens have souls, and was he being culturally insensitive by even thinking about souls around aliens who might not have the same spiritual concepts? And all of this was happening simultaneously, while Marcus was also thinking about the structural engineering of the dining hall ceiling, wondering if Zeph'tal was feeling okay because he looked a bit pale, calculating how many credits he needed to graduate, remembering a joke his roommate had told him about quantum physicists, and planning what he wanted to write in his next letter home to his parents. Zeph'tal's mental probe began to fracture under the strain. He had trained for years to handle the organized thoughts of advanced civilizations, the hive minds of insectoid species, even the abstract mathematical consciousness of energy beings. But this was like trying to follow 17 different conversations in 4 languages while riding a roller coaster during an earthquake. Focus, he told himself, his telepathic abilities starting to spark erratically around his temples. There has to be a core consciousness. Every species has a primary thought stream. He pushed deeper, and suddenly found himself trapped in a loop where Marcus was simultaneously feeling homesick for Earth, excited about being at the academy, worried about his grades, confident about his abilities, terrified of making mistakes, and absolutely convinced that everything would work out fine because it always did, except for all those times when it did not. But those times had taught him valuable lessons. So really they were good things, but they were still terrifying in retrospect, which made him appreciate the current moment, which made him anxious about losing this moment, which made him sad about the passage of time, which made him happy to be alive to experience sadness. Zeph'tal's eye was now twitching so violently that Blixandra was starting to look concerned. "Ah, buddy?" Marcus said, reaching across the table. "You look like you are about to short-circuit or something. Should I call someone?" The concerned tone in Marcus's voice triggered something in his subconscious, and Zeph'tal's battered mental probe suddenly plunged through a trapdoor he had not even seen coming. One moment he was drowning in the human's contradictory thoughts about temporal philosophy and fish souls, and the next he was free-falling into what could only be described as Marcus's dream storage unit. The first thing Zeph'tal encountered was a zombie apocalypse. But not just any zombie apocalypse. This was a zombie apocalypse, where the undead were also his high school math teachers, and they were chasing him through a shopping mall that kept rearranging itself like a Rubik's Cube, and he was trying to find the exit, but kept getting distracted by a sale on shoes that he did not even need, because when did zombies start caring about footwear anyway? What in the name of all that is sacred and quantum? Zeph'tal whispered, his physical body starting to shake. But the nightmare was just getting started. The zombie math teachers suddenly transformed into a giant spider wearing his mother's face, which would have been traumatic enough, except the spider was also giving him a performance review at his summer job from 3 years ago, and somehow he was simultaneously terrified of the spider and mortified that he might not get a good reference letter. And then, without warning, the spider vanished and Marcus was falling through space, but not dramatic, peaceful space like in the movies. This was space filled with all the emails he had ever failed to send, floating around him like accusatory ghosts. And each email was also somehow a giant eyeball judging his life choices. Zeph'tal tried to retreat, but human nightmares apparently did not follow the same rules as normal consciousness. The deeper he had gone, the harder it became to find his way back out. He was trapped in a maze of anxiety dreams that defied all logic and several laws of physics. Now Marcus was simultaneously being chased by a monster that looked like his third-grade teacher crossed with a filing cabinet, while also sitting in a dentist chair getting his teeth cleaned by tiny versions of himself, while also giving a presentation to a boardroom full of people who were all his ex-girlfriend but with the heads of various farm animals. "This is impossible," Zeph'tal gasped, his blue skin starting to turn a sickly green color. How does this creature's mind not collapse from the sheer contradiction? But the worst part was yet to come. Because underneath all the surreal horror and anxiety, Marcus was also thinking about grocery shopping. Not just thinking about it, planning it. In detail. While being chased by monster teachers and judged by email eyeballs, some part of his subconscious was calmly composing a shopping list that included milk, eggs, bread, those crackers his roommate liked, maybe some fruit, but not bananas, because they always went bad too fast. And should he try that new brand of cereal that was on sale, even though he had not really liked the last new cereal he had tried, but this one might be different, and it was only $2 more than his usual brand. The human was experiencing existential terror and consumer decision-making fatigue simultaneously, and somehow both were equally important to his mental processing system. Zeph'tal's telepathic abilities began to spark and fizz like a damaged circuit board. His species had evolved to handle orderly thoughts, logical progressions, rational fear responses. This was like trying to drink from a fire hose while riding a unicycle during a meteor shower. The nightmare shifted again. Now Marcus was trapped in an elevator that was also somehow his childhood bedroom, and the elevator was going to fall, but also it might not. And he was supposed to be somewhere important, but he could not remember where. And he was wearing his pajamas, but they were also a business suit. And there was a presentation he was supposed to give about something he had never studied, but also he was pretty sure he had studied it. Maybe in a dream. Or was this the dream? And throughout all of this chaos, Marcus was still thinking about whether he should call his mom this weekend, and if the aliens had figured out pizza yet, and whether his college roommate had ever returned that book he borrowed. And what book was it anyway? And did it matter? Because they were probably both going to die in the climate crisis anyway. But maybe they would not. And should he be more optimistic about the future? And was it irresponsible to be optimistic when there were so many problems in the world? But also, was it irresponsible to be pessimistic because that just made things worse? In the physical world, Zeph'tal's hands began to clench uncontrollably. His breathing became rapid and shallow. Other students were starting to notice that something was seriously wrong with their resident telepathic bully. "Zeph'tal?" Lixandra called out, her scales shifting to worried yellow-green. "What is happening?" But Zeph'tal could not answer. He was too busy experiencing the uniquely human ability to be simultaneously bored and terrified, to process trauma through elaborate mental gymnastics that somehow involved both deep philosophical questions and mundane daily concerns. The human mind, he was beginning to realize, was not primitive at all. It was the most sophisticated chaos engine in the known galaxy, capable of processing contradictory information streams that would crash any artificial intelligence and overwhelm any telepathic species. Marcus was still eating his sandwich, completely unaware that he had just mentally assaulted one of the Academy's most feared students simply by existing normally. Zeph'tal tried one more time to retreat from the nightmare zone, but instead found himself face to face with Marcus's recurring dream about showing up late to an exam for a class he had forgotten he was taking. Except the exam was also a job interview, and the interviewer was a giant hamster who kept asking him about his 5-year plan. That was when Zeph'tal began hyperventilating in 17 different languages. Panic. Pure, unadulterated panic flooded through Zeph'tal's consciousness as he desperately tried to extract his mental probe from the swirling vortex of human thoughts. But every attempt to retreat only dragged him deeper into Marcus's stream of consciousness, which was less like a stream and more like being caught in a Category 5 hurricane made of pure mental energy. Emergency extraction protocols, he gasped, calling upon every telepathic technique his instructors had ever taught him. Mental barriers, cognitive firewalls, psychic circuit breakers. Nothing worked. Human consciousness, it seemed, did not follow any known rules of mental engagement. Instead of the orderly retreat he was attempting, Zeph'tal found himself swept along in the relentless current of Marcus's thoughts, which at this very moment was simultaneously focused on at least 14 completely unrelated topics. Marcus was thinking about his quantum mechanics homework, specifically whether Professor Klemdar expected them to show their work for the probability calculations. But also he was wondering if he should go to that party on Saturday night, even though he did not really know anyone there. But maybe that was the point of parties, to meet people. But what if he said something stupid, like that time in 3rd grade, when he told Jenny Morrison that her hair looked like spaghetti and she cried, which he still felt bad about even though it was 20 years ago. But maybe he should look her up on social media and apologize. But would that be weird after all this time? And speaking of weird, did aliens have social media? And if they did, what would alien memes look like? Stop! Zeph'tal screamed, but his mental voice was completely lost in the chaos. Because Marcus was not finished. Oh no, he was just getting started. While simultaneously processing his guilt about Jenny Morrison's hair and alien social media speculation, Marcus was also worrying about his parents, who were getting older and he should call them more often. But what would he tell them about being in space? Because they were not supposed to know about the exchange program being real. The government had been very clear about that, which reminded him that he needed to file his tax return when he got back to Earth, assuming the IRS still existed by then. And did aliens pay taxes? And if so, to whom? And was there some kind of galactic revenue service? Zeph'tal's mental probe began to fracture under the strain. His consciousness was being stretched across too many simultaneous thought processes, like trying to listen to 17 different radio stations at the same time while solving math problems and remembering grocery lists. But Marcus's mind just kept going. Now he was wondering if his roommate had remembered to water the plants, while also calculating how much the textbooks for next semester would cost, while also remembering that embarrassing moment in high school when he tripped during the graduation ceremony, while also speculating about whether aliens had discovered coffee yet, and if not, should he introduce them to it? But would that be cultural contamination? And was he overthinking this? He was definitely overthinking this, but maybe overthinking was better than underthinking. Although what was the optimal amount of thinking really? Make it stop, make it stop, make it stop. Zeph'tal chanted, his physical body beginning to convulse as his telepathic abilities overloaded. The worst part was that all of these thoughts were happening simultaneously, with equal weight and importance in Marcus's consciousness. There was no hierarchy, no priority system, no logical flow from one idea to the next. It was pure, beautiful, terrifying chaos, and somehow Marcus was functioning perfectly normally, while his brain processed information in ways that would crash any known artificial intelligence system. The dining hall had gone completely silent now. Every student was staring as Zeph'tal writhed in his anti-grav chair, his blue skin cycling through colors that most species did not even have names for. Sparks of psychic energy were shooting from his temples like a malfunctioning neural interface. "Someone call medical," Professor Klemdar shouted, floating over as fast as his mobility disc would carry him. "Is he having a seizure?" Blixendra asked, her scales now flashing emergency red. "Worse," Mortwing observed, his bioluminescent patches strobing in what his species used to indicate extreme concern. "He is having a telepathic breakdown." Marcus finally looked up from his sandwich, apparently noticing the commotion for the first time. "Oh wow. Is he okay? Should I do something? I know CPR, but I am not sure if it works on aliens. Do you guys have hearts in the same place as humans? Actually, do you have hearts at all? Or is it more of a distributed circulatory system?" And even as he expressed genuine concern for Zeph'tal's well-being, part of Marcus's mind was still wondering whether the cafeteria served dessert. "Whoa, hey there," Marcus said, abandoning his sandwich and moving around the table with surprising speed. "You look like you are about to pass out. Here, lean forward, put your head between your knees. That usually helps with the whole fainting thing." The simple act of human kindness hit Zeph'tal like a psychic sledgehammer. Through his fractured mental probe, he could feel Marcus's genuine concern radiating outward like warm sunlight. But underneath that concern, the human's mind was still running its impossible multitasking routine, worrying about Zeph'tal while simultaneously remembering a first aid course from college, while wondering if alien physiology was different enough to make human medical knowledge useless, while calculating whether he had enough time to finish his homework before dinner, while thinking about calling his sister to wish her happy birthday. I cannot." Zeph'tal gasped, his telepathic abilities finally snapping back into his own consciousness like a broken rubber band. The sudden silence in his head was almost as jarring as the chaos had been. "Cannot what? Breathe?" "Yeah, panic attacks are rough," Marcus said, patting Zeph'tal's shoulder with the casual familiarity of someone who had dealt with anxiety before. "My roommate gets them sometimes. Just focus on breathing in for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4. Nice and steady." The breathing technique actually worked, which somehow made everything worse. How did this primitive creature know more about managing mental distress than a species that had been studying consciousness for millennia? "You," Zeph'tal wheezed, staring at Marcus with a mixture of awe and terror. "You are not simple at all." Marcus laughed, a sound that somehow managed to be both self-deprecating and genuinely amused. "Simple? Dude, I wish. My brain is like a browser with 47 tabs open, and half of them are playing music while the other half are running videos about conspiracy theories involving breakfast cereals." Professor Klemdar arrived with the medical team, but Zeph'tal waved them away with a shaking hand. He needed to understand what had just happened to him, what he had just experienced. "Your mind," he said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "How do you function with all of that chaos?" Marcus supplied helpfully. "Oh, you picked up on that, huh? Yeah, that is pretty much constant. Right now I am thinking about whether you are okay, but also about whether my grandmother would have liked this place because she always wanted to travel, but never got the chance before she passed. And also I am wondering if I left my room light on this morning, and also trying to remember if I have that essay due tomorrow or Thursday, and also thinking about how weird it is that we are having this conversation in space." The casual way Marcus delivered this revelation made Zeph'tal's remaining telepathic defenses crumble entirely. This was not a primitive mind. This was not a simple consciousness. This was the most sophisticated information processing system he had ever encountered, capable of maintaining dozens of simultaneous thought processes without losing coherence or functionality. "But how?" Zeph'tal asked, his voice filled with something approaching reverence. "How do you maintain sanity? How do you make decisions? How do you focus on anything when your mind is processing so much information simultaneously?" Marcus shrugged, as if describing the most complex mental phenomenon in known space was no big deal. "I guess we are just used to it. Humans are pretty good at compartmentalizing. Like I can be sad about my grandmother and excited about lunch and anxious about my grades all at the same time, and that is just Tuesday for us. The dining hall was slowly returning to normal, with students going back to their meals and conversations. But Zeph'tal remained frozen in his chair, staring at Marcus with the expression of someone whose entire worldview had just been turned inside out and shaken vigorously. "We thought you were primitive," he whispered. "Yeah, we get that a lot," Marcus replied cheerfully. "But honestly, if thinking about 17 things at once while having an existential crisis and planning dinner is primitive, I would hate to see what you guys consider advanced." Zeph'tal started laughing. Not the cruel, mocking laughter he was known for, but the kind of laughter that came from genuine amazement and just a touch of hysteria. He had tried to bully the most mentally advanced species in the galaxy. Word traveled through Galactic Academy faster than a quantum entanglement message. By the time the evening meal cycle arrived, every student in the facility knew that Zeph'tal the Vortharch, terror of freshmen and nightmare of the telepathically vulnerable, had been mentally overwhelmed by a human eating a sandwich. The story grew with each telling, as stories tend to do. Some versions claimed Marcus had psychically counterattacked with Earth battle techniques. Others suggested he had some kind of mental defense system that humans developed to fight off alien mind control. A few particularly creative chittery students started a rumor that humans were actually a warrior species disguised as primitives, conducting reconnaissance for an eventual invasion. Marcus, blissfully unaware of his newfound celebrity status, continued attending classes and making friends with the casual ease of someone who had not just accidentally broken the Academy's most feared telepath. "I still do not understand what happened," he confided to Blixendra during their shared xenobiology lecture. "One minute we were talking, the next minute he was hyperventilating in colors I did not know existed." "You happened," she replied, her scales shimmering with amused orange. "Your brain happened." Poor Zeph'tal tried to read the mind of a species that thinks about grocery shopping while having existential crises. Meanwhile, Zeph'tal had become something of a legend himself, though not the kind he had originally intended. Students would point and whisper when he walked by. "That is the guy who got his mind blown by a human." His reputation as a psychic bully evaporated overnight. Replaced by something far more interesting, he was now the alien who had survived first contact with human consciousness and lived to tell about it. The experience had changed him fundamentally. Gone was the arrogant swagger and casual cruelty. In its place was a kind of stunned respect for the sheer complexity of mental existence. He found himself approaching other students with genuine curiosity instead of predatory intent, asking about their thoughts rather than forcibly extracting them. Professor Klemdar, ever the academic opportunist, immediately began restructuring his consciousness studies curriculum to include what he termed human mental chaos theory. Within a week he had submitted 17 research proposals to the Galactic Academic Council, all focused on understanding how humans manage to maintain cognitive function while processing impossible amounts of contradictory information. "This changes everything we thought we knew about intelligence," he announced during a faculty meeting, his tentacled beard practically vibrating with excitement. "We have been measuring mental sophistication by organization and logic. But what if chaos itself is the highest form of cognitive evolution?" Zeph'tal, for his part, quietly withdrew from his unofficial career as a telepathic bully. The idea of deliberately invading someone's mind now seemed not just cruel but also potentially hazardous to his own mental health. He had seen what lurked in the depths of human consciousness, and he was not eager for a repeat performance. Instead, he found himself genuinely interested in his studies for the first time in years, particularly Professor Klemdar's new theories about chaos-based intelligence systems. After all, if he was going to share a galaxy with humans, he might as well try to understand them. 3 weeks later, Zeph'tal found Marcus in the Academy's observation lounge, staring out at the swirling nebula that dominated the local star system. The human had become something of a fixture there, often sitting for hours just watching the cosmic light show with the kind of peaceful expression that suggested his mind was, for once, relatively quiet. Zeph'tal approached cautiously, his telepathic abilities firmly locked down. He had learned his lesson about probing human consciousness without permission. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. "Not at all," Marcus replied, gesturing to the empty chair beside him. It is beautiful out there, is it not? All those colors and patterns, makes you Marcus, he said carefully, if you do not mind me asking, what are you thinking about right now? Marcus turned to him with that same friendly smile he had worn on the first day, completely unaware of the cosmic significance of the question he was being asked. Oh, just wondering if you guys dream about electric sheep too. Zeph'tal hit the floor with a resounding thud that echoed through the entire observation lounge. Some questions, it seemed, were better left unasked.